Zimmerman, who is tonight's speaker, is going to present a slideshow on the 1864 retreat of Hood's army from Nashville. He says brutal, so we'll find out. He's a retired newspaper man and a member of the Nashville Civil War Roundtable. He has self-published several books, non-fiction books that is, and at one time lived in Oshkosh and was a Packers fan. Can you believe it? He does have books for sale, so when he's done talking, he'll sell you a book. Mark.
Packers fan, always a Packers fan. Okay. I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a real honor for me to be here in this magnificent Wisconsin Club facility. And like I said, I was born in Rockford, Illinois, Little Chicago, and lived several years in Oshkosh, and became a Packers fan, and then I went south. Tonight, I'm going to present a slideshow based on my book. First of all, I think, no, I guess not. It's based on my book, which I call a detailed overview of a convoluted mess, the pursuit of John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee after the rout at Nashville by Federals under George Henry Thomas. I'm going to put a plug in for 3 of my other Civil War books, including my latest, Fortress Nashville, which was named one of the top 10 Civil War books of 2022 by Civil War Books and Authors. Going back to here, this book is available online at Amazon as a paperback book or an ebook. Here's my website that you can read all about my books and order them from there. Okay, we're going to start on the impressions of the pursuit. It was a unique event of the Civil War, according to the late great Ed Bars. A full retreat and pursuit over 10 days and 100 miles of near constant combat through rough terrain and miserable winter weather. Edward Longacre, biographer of U.S. Cavalry Commander James Harrison Wilson, said the pursuit was one of the most devastating in American history. Ross Massey, historian for the Battle of Nashville Trust, said no army in the war has endured a more miserable and depressing episode than did the Army of Tennessee on this retreat. Federal Surgeon George E. Cooper said probably in no part of the war have the men suffered more than in the month of December 1864. Now, I want to say right offhand that the number of casualties on this pursuit and retreat were relatively light. We're not talking about Shiloh or Chickamauga here. They're very difficult to ascertain, especially on the Confederate side with any amount of precision. For example, the 2-day Battle of Nashville was 3,000 casualties, 300 dead. I think it was a little bit more than that, but that's to be said. On the other hand, on the retreat, I believe that 5,000 to 10,000 horses and mules perished. Army of the Tennessee historian Stanley Horn said on the aftermath of the Battle of Nashville, he said this very well. The next 10 days was a nightmare of nerve-wracking hardship and struggle for both armies. Alternating marching and fighting, worn down by battle fatigue and sheer physical exhaustion, they somehow managed to carry on an almost continuous running battle from Nashville to the Tennessee River. The weather was abominable. Rain, sleet, and snow with below freezing temperatures. Wagons and guns churned roads into seemingly bottomless quagmires, from which was frozen to sharp-edged ruts during the cold nights. Heavy rains not only drenched the suffering soldiers, but soon flooded streams and made passage of each of them a serious problem. Yes, it was brutal. The retreat, and I'm going to go here, and I'm going to look at a map. This is a map overall of the retreat and pursuit, starting up at Nashville on the Cumberland River and moving southward all the way down into Alabama, down to Bainbridge on the Tennessee River. Crossing the red marks are the major conflicts. They had to cross the Duck River at Columbia, of course the Harpeth River at Franklin, down to Pulaski. Pulaski is where the paved turnpike ended and the railroad ended, and then through these so-called roads down through this rugged terrain down to the river. The retreat began with a rout at Compton's Hill, now called Shives Hill, late on Friday, December 16th. Units of Hood's army organized to establish holding actions which allowed much of the infantry to escape through Brentwood and surge southward to the village of Franklin. Fighting was fierce on December 17th with hand-to-hand combat north of Franklin and a major confrontation at a tributary of the West Harpeth River. Command of the Confederate rearguard changed hands several times in the first few days as federal troopers armed with repeating rifles tried to outflank them on the turnpike. Use of the paved turnpike, which ran from Nashville to Franklin to Columbia to Pulaski, was vital on both sides. Many rivers and streams had to be crossed. What I did here was I drew a map showing the retreat going from left to right, from north to south. I'll get a little more detail in there, and you can see all of the streams and rivers that had to be crossed over in the pursuit. And you can see the major turnpike there was the vital route on this. Many rivers and streams had to be crossed, destroyed bridges had to be replaced, rainy conditions turned small creeks into raging torrents. There was much skirmishing along Rutherford Creek, which was difficult to cross. Arrival of the federal Taunton train was delayed due to critical errors. That's what it bars says, Taunton. Then the weather turned bitterly cold with snowfall. The Duck River at Columbia was a major obstacle, as was arrival of Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He employed delaying tactics to hasten the retreat while battling his tormentors all the way through Pulaski to the state line. Major conflicts were fought at Linville and Richland Creek north of Pulaski and at Anthony's Hill and Sugar Creek south of that town. By that time, Confederate troops were slowly crossing the Tennessee River to safety on rickety pontoon bridge as last chance fighting evolved into a pure cavalry match. I'm going to be talking rather quickly now. We've got a lot of ground to cover, literally. These are some of the engagements on the retreat. Give you a little background as to the timeline throughout the second 2 weeks of December. Okay, we're going to talk about commanders. Federal vanguard, the infantry was commanded by General Thomas J. Wood of the 4th Corps. The cavalry is commanded by Brevet Major General James Harry Wilson. He was one of the boy wonders of the war. He was born in Shawneetown, Illinois, on the Ohio. He was an 1860 graduate of West Point. He was a slight person of light complexion with a rather pinched face. He was competent and dutiful, but also arrogant, highly ambitious, impatient, outspoken, a glory hunter of the first magnitude, and a stranger to humility and self-doubt. Wilson first served as the chief topo engineer for the Federal Army of the Tennessee. He was the engineer during the Vicksburg campaign. He became very good friends with U.S. Grant. He was the only officer from Grant's regular staff to be promoted to troop command. In early 1864, Wilson reorganized the Federal Cavalry Bureau, and one of the things he did, getting ahead of myself a little bit. Here's Wilson's cavalry command, 4 divisions. 1st Division, basically a brigade under John Croxton. 5th Division under Hatch was brigades led by Bob Stewart and Davis Coon. 6th Division, and you, 6th Division, Richard Johnson, 1st Brigade, Colonel Thomas Harrison, and then James Biddle. Biddle's brigade was unmounted. 7th Division was Joseph Knight, led by Brigadier General John Hammond, and Gilbert Johnson. And here's pictures of the federal commanders. They prefer facial hair. Okay, this is a Spencer repeating carbine, 52 caliber brass rimfire, 22-inch long barrel. To operate it, you lowered the trigger guard to eject the spent cartridge. You raised it to insert a fresh cartridge. You manually cocked the hammer. You aimed and you shot and you repeated over and over again. It had a tubular magazine, spring-loaded with 7 shots that went up to the buttstock of the carbine, and that's how you got your repeating fire. Spare magazines were carried in a Blakesley cartridge box, which could carry 10 to 12 magazines. Here's an illustration that shows federal troopers firing their Spencers. The trooper in the foreground is firing from a prone position. The man behind him is reloading a magazine. Hopefully the muzzle is not buried in the dirt. The man behind him is firing from a crouching position. And then behind him, of course, is the officer with his cabin ball pistols in his belt. Now, supposedly Wilson had 12,000 troopers, all on fine steeds, all armed with repeating rifles. This is Jim Kay, former president of Battle of Nashville Trust, avid relic hunter who does reside on the battlefield. He says it's a big misconception that Wilson's troopers all had Spencers. The relics do not support that, although the search is incomplete. He said he's found more Maynard and Burnside cartridges than Spencers, and some of the federal infantry used Spencers. And Sharp's cartridges begin to show up at the Battle of the Barricade, which is one of the conflicts we're going to be talking about here soon. Wilson had a serious shortage of horsepower before the Battle of Nashville. Wilson said that within 7 days, 7,000 horses were obtained in Middle Tennessee and Western Kentucky. Every horse and mare that could be used was taken. All streetcar and livery stable horses and private carriage and saddle horses were seized. Even Andrew Johnson, the vice president-elect, was forced to give up his pair of horses. A clean sweep was made of every animal that could carry a cavalryman. And for this, Johnson called Wilson a bumptious puppy. I maintain that given that this happened, that Wilson's horses were probably not the best stocked and probably not the best trained. Okay, we're going to talk about a little bit here about the Confederate rear guard during the retreat. Stephen Gill Lee, no relation to Robert E., was a very young Corps commander. His Corps was not heavily engaged at Franklin or at Nashville, and he was responsible for the rear guard in the first day and a half of the pursuit. He was wounded. Command went over to Carter Stevenson, who fought at the West Carpet. Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, another Corps commander, was in charge of the rear guard near Rutherford Creek, north of Columbia. And then from Columbia south, Forrest was in charge of the overall rear guard. Walthall was in charge of the infantry rear guard. And there were several soldiers that said that Alexander Peter Stewart, another Corps commander, was really actually in command during the retreat instead of Hood. That's debatable, I suppose. And here is a breakdown of Forrest Cavalry Corps. Chalmers Division was at the Battle of Nashville with Rutgers Brigade. Biffle's brigade was very under strength. The other two brigades were at Murfreesboro with Forrest during the Battle of Nashville. Buford's division, Crossland was wounded 3 times, so Buford basically took over the Kentucky troopers in that brigade. Buford was a very interesting fellow, weighed over 300 pounds, was very nimble, red beard, and he was an excellent judge of horse flesh and an excellent equestrian. Kyrie Bell, who was actually older than Buford, was from Tennessee, and he was in charge of the Tennesseans. Jackson, William Hicks, Red Jackson, had Armstrong's brigade of Mississippians and Ross's brigade of Texans. Armstrong is an interesting character. He fought for the Union during the First Battle of Bull Run and then changed sides for the rest of the war. And Forest Artillery was led by Captain John Morton, 22 years old, another boy wonder of the war, I guess, and he had 5 batteries of artillery, and he was an excellent artilleryman and used very wisely. And here's a picture of the Confederate cavalrymen. They too also like the picture. Just briefly, before the Battle of Nashville, Hood came up from Atlanta and invaded Tennessee from northern Alabama, crossing the Tennessee up, going to capture Nashville. And when the war, Sherman took off the other direction in his march to the sea. There's John Bell Hood, and there's how they came up through Tennessee, the 3 separate corps, several cavalry clashes, you can see. I don't know if you can even, you can see, oh yeah, right around here. Here was Columbia, and of course here is Spring Hill, and then going on up to Nashville. Battle of Nashville. Federals attacked Hood's army on Thursday, December 15th, forcing them back 2 miles into a shorter line which ran from Compton's Hill in the west to Peach Orchard Hill in the east. Okay, this is the second day of the Battle of Nashville. Oh gosh. Okay, here's the Confederate line on the first day. They fell back here to the Confederate line on the second day. This is Compton Hill here. The line was refused to 2 other hills below it. This is the central part of the line with A.P. Stewart behind the stone wall, several artillery batteries. This is Cheatham's corps with Bates' division on the hill. Over here is Peach Orchard Hill. This is S.D. Lee's corps here. This road here is Granny White Pike. This is the Franklin Pike. This is the Nashville and Decatur Railroad right here. This is Hillsville Pike over to the west. Following 3 p.m. attacks on Peach Orchard Hill, Pat Thomas rode to the west flank and consulted with Schofield and Wilson. With a low growl, he advised them, the battle must be fought, even if men are killed. Then they noticed Brigadier General John MacArthur, who happens to be from Chicago, Illinois, moving against the hill. Thomas told Schofield, General Smith, General MacArthur, is attacking without waiting for you. Please advance your entire line. By the time Wilson galloped away and got back to his own men, the rout was on. Fortunately for the Army of Tennessee, darkness was rapidly falling, as was a cold, hard rain. And Wilson's troopers could not immediately pursue in any great number. They had been fighting dismounted, and it took time to get mounted and organized for a pursuit. Wilson later explained, rapid movements across rough country and plowed fields in the dark is near impossible. Our troopers could hardly see their horses' ears. As Confederate troops swarmed from Peach Orchard Hill with the Federals in hot pursuit, S.T. Lee rallied his men about half a mile south on the Franklin Pike near the Overton estate, using Randall Gibson and his Louisiana Brigade as a rear guard. With Captain Douglas of Texas swinging a few pieces of field artillery hastily into position. Further south on the pike, Clayton began reforming his division, now consisting of the brigades of Stovall and Holtzclaw. Wilson ordered Richard Johnson to move down the Hillsborough Pike to Franklin and hit Chalmers, who was protecting Hood's wagon train in flank. Give him no peace, Wilson told Johnson. Time is all he wants. Do not give him any. Okay, this is Compton's Hill. This is now called Shies Hill. They were almost surrounded by Federal infantry and the cavalry down here. Cavalry was cutting off the Granny White Pike in their line of escape, so they had to go southeastward from there. This is a picture of the Battle of Nashville. Minnesota troops fighting at Shies Hill, which is in the background. This is by Howard Pyle. It sits or hangs in the governor's office and at the Minnesota State House and also above my bed. Okay, the next slide is a panoramic view of the summit of Compton's Hill, looking from north to south. There were far fewer trees at the time of the battle. The Nashville Battle of Nashville Trust keeps this hill. Confederate line was placed at the geographic crest, which was too high rather than the military crest. It's because they did it in the dark. Now, we're talking about a division of men on top of this hill. The hill's a little bit flatter than it was during the war. That's not much room. Just a little side note, a monument to the 114th Illinois has been put up on Shies Hill very recently. There's also a monument to the Minnesota troops. This is the Illinois monument down, you can barely see it down here is the Minnesota monument. They've redone these trails up Shies Hill, which is quite steep. It's making it a lot easier for people to get up to the top. Okay. Here is Compton Hill right here, Peach Orchard Hill here. Union Federal Cavalry is here. Ironically, Confederate Cavalry is down here. They can't get down this escape route, so they have to go over here to the Franklin Pike. These are the Overton Hills. They're not very tall, but they're very steep and heavily wooded. There's a little gorge here that they managed to go through, but they did have to go this way. S.D. Lee's men put up a rear guard about here, allowing the Confederates to escape down to the Brentwood rail station down there. Okay, we're going to talk about the battle at the barricade at dusk on December 16th. Reaching Granny White Pike via a narrow farm lane, Rucker united with D.C. Kelly's men. Rucker's brigade, totaling 1,200 men, constructed a stout barricade of logs, brush, and fence wells across the roadway, about 3¼ miles south of Compton Hill. Also manning the structure was the 7th Alabama, which included a company of cadets from the University of Tuscaloosa. Wilson said it was one of the fiercest conflicts that ever took place in the Civil War. His foe fought with uncommon fierceness, a scene of pandemonium in which flashing carbines, whistling bullets, bursting shells, and imprecations of struggling men filled the air. Above the din, while men fired their weapons at muzzle flashes, Kelly extorted, "Pour it into them, boys, pour it into them." Edmund Rucker, facing you, engaged in a celebrated saber duel with Colonel George Spaulding. Some say it was Boyer. You can see his carbine there at his side. You'll notice it's not a Spencer repeating carbine, probably a Smith. During this duel, they somehow exchanged sabers with each other. Rucker was shot in the arm and disabled and captured. and eventually, Rucker engaged Spaulding in a celebrated saber duel and spent the night at Wilson's headquarters, where he convinced him that Forrest was in the vicinity, which he was not. The next day, Rucker's arm was amputated. Wilson was chomping at the bit to get started in his quest to bag Hood's army. This late in the year, the sun rose at 7 a.m. and only provided about 9 hours of daylight. Steady rainfall was turning all the terrain off the turnpike into a muddy quagmire and raising the levels of the waterways so fast that few places were still fordable. The rebels, of course, were destroying bridges after crossing them. We're going to talk about Hollow Tree Gap now. Well, actually, Thomas came down to Wilson and said, "Dang it to hell, Wilson, didn't I tell you we could lick them?" Going on to the next day, there's 4 engagements at the Franklin sector, Harpeth River and the West Harpeth River. I'm going to talk about Hollow Tree Gap first. You can see here's Brentwood Station right here. Here's Franklin, and here's Hollow Tree Gap, about halfway in between. And then you can see at Franklin, the Carter House, and Carson, and it becomes the Columbia Turnpike now. And there's also the Lewisburg Pike and the Carter Creek Pike. And here's the West Harpeth River, and there's where the Battle of the West Harpeth was fought. On December 17th at 9 a.m. at Hollow Tree Gap, 2 mounted federal regiments attempted to overpower the rear guard. While the 19th Pennsylvania drove down the pike, the 10th Indiana circled around the Confederate right flank and threatened to engulf it. The Federals initially were repulsed, with a loss of 22 killed and wounded and 63 captured. But then the rear guard, wounded that the Hoosiers might outflank them, fell back towards Franklin. The 10th Indiana Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Gresham captured 2 flags, 2 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, and 110 enlisted men, mostly from the 4th and 30th Louisiana. Historian Nathaniel Hughes wrote about Hollow Tree Gap. This small cavalry rear guard action marked the beginning of systematic, effective deployment of cavalry as a defensive screen of Hood's retreating army. The Federal cavalry from this day forward would exercise far more caution in their pursuit, worrying about rushing into an ambush as they attempted to bring Hood's army to bay. Captain Obadiah Hayden of the 9th Indiana Cavalry said the guns and other equipment strewn along the road, the apparent abandonment of everything that impeded their flight, every dooryard filled with ill-clad, shivering prisoners, had led us to the conclusion that we had a walkover. Hollow Tree Gap undeceived us. Little sound effect there. Perhaps the largest cavalry engagement on American soil took place along Franklin Pike and the Nashville and Decatur Railroad, sweeping across what is now the Harlingsdale Farm. Now, the Battle of Brandy Station in Virginia in June of 1863, 18,456 horsemen involved, is acknowledged as the largest cavalry battle of the war. At 10:30 a.m., Wilson's cavalry of 3,000 men crashed into the Confederate earthworks just north of the Harpeth River. Vastly outnumbered, Gibson's men and supporting cavalry fought as long as they could before nearly being surrounded. They then fled over the Ponton Bridge, having lost 13 killed, 25 wounded, and 364 captured. Stymieing the Federals was the fact that the Confederates had strung wire around tree stumps, and the horses didn't like that very much. Wilson said it was killing work for both sides. The rain was still pouring, and the fields on both sides of the road soaking wet. The pursuit raged through the village of Franklin. What men found there was unnerving and disheartening. The sight of fierce fighting 2 weeks earlier, the town sheltered more than 2,000 wounded, including 250 Federals, in 45 makeshift hospitals. This just shows a map of Franklin. Here was the Ranger was abandoned during this conflict. And here is where that picture was at the railroad overpass. The Harpeth River at Franklin was a formidable obstacle. Woods' 4th Corps of Infantry moving down the main pike was delayed for 18 hours at the Harpeth. Wood recalled Colonel Isaac Suman of the 9th Indiana nobly volunteered to build the bridge, and thanks to his energy and ingenuity and industry of his gallant regiment, it was ready for the Corps at daylight morning of the 18th. Though he had few conveniences in the way of tools, the scantiest materials, and the stream was rising rapidly. It was becoming apparent to the Federal infantry that the best of their pontooniers were away with Sherman in Georgia. Federal ponton train was desperately needed at the Harpeth River, but where was it? General Thomas that morning, groggy from sleep, had ordered the ponton train down the Murfreesboro pike instead of down the Franklin pike, for reasons unknown. The wagon train commander got down the pike for a while, then decided this is crazy, there's nothing down here. So he decided to make up time by taking a shortcut and ran into a muddy field, and then they had to back around again, and then they had to back around back to Nashville, and then down the Franklin pike. Lost a lot of time doing that. At 1:30 p.m. just south of Franklin, Wilson reorganized his troopers. Johnson's division would move along the Federal right flank down Carter's Creek pike to the west. Hatch and Knight would pursue directly down what was now the Columbia pike in 2 parallel columns. Croxton's brigade would advance eastward along the Lewisburg pike and eventually halt for the night at Douglas Church. Along the way, Croxton would capture 130 more prisoners. These are ponton boats, obviously under carriages. This is a picture, actually this is at Fredericksburg, but it's just a picture showing Federal engineers building a ponton bridge across the river, and as they're doing it, they're under fire, of course. The Battle of the West Harpeth River. This is from the OR Atlas, showing the West Harpeth River. It's actually a tributary of the West Harpeth River. And as I said, S.D. Lee was wounded in the foot at Winstead Hill. Carter Stevenson took over, and his infantry set up a line across the turnpike. And it's hard to see on this, but if you go and examine the ground, this is a slight rise here. They're on the back side of that rise, so the Federals will get about right here before they could even see that Stevenson's troopers are there. Better map of that. Federal cavalry pushed boldly through Franklin, constantly harassing the rear guard until they met Clayton's men at Winstead Hill. Lee was wounded in the foot. Carter Stevenson took over. Down the turnpike came the Federal troopers, Knight attacking in front while Hatch worked the Confederate right flank and Johnson the left flank. Hatch was forced to delay his attack as Federals got mixed in with Confederate stragglers. Confederates moved their artillery into position during this delay. Wilson then ordered Hatch and Knight to form ranks and charge. He directed his escort of 180 men, the 4th U.S. Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Joseph Hedges, to form in columns of 4 and charge straight down the pike. Hedges moved off the pike to allow the Chicago Board of Trade artillery battery to return fire. Hedges crashed his 4th U.S. regulars into the rebel line, sabers drawn and slashing. Douglas's battery opened up with deadly canister, throwing the Federals backwards and leaving the commander stranded. Hedges waved his hat and yelled, "The Yankees are coming, run for your lives." The ruse worked and Hedges escaped. Stevenson was forced back and crossed the stream, fighting every turn of the way. At one point, the infantry forming into a 3-sided hollow square. Finally, with darkness at hand, he briefly halted to reorganize his lines, only to be struck again by Hatch. In the darkness, men could not discern friend or foe. Units mingled. Men were wearing slickers and some Confederates wearing blue jackets. For fierceness, the skirmishing exceeded any his regiment had ever engaged in, wrote a veteran sergeant of the 2nd Iowa Cavalry. One cavalryman under the Confederates described the brutality of the fighting. He said, "The enemy's cavalry swooped down upon us with drawn sabers, cutting and slashing us from right to left. 3 soldiers assaulted General Buford at one time. One he shot, another he struck over the head with the butt of his pistol, and the third he grabbed by the hair and pulled from the saddle and thus escaped. They swarmed all around me like a flock of blackbirds. How I got out of it with a whole skin, I do not know. My face was powder burned and my hair was scorched from a pistol shot thrust in my face at the moment of discharge, and I found myself with 2 severe bruises on my shoulder from saber strokes." Exhilarated but winded, Wilson was forced to call off the pursuit due to exhaustion and darkness. He exclaimed, "Hatch is a brick. If it had only been light, we certainly would have destroyed their entire rear guard. As it was, they were severely punished." Wilson said the west part of the fair was another running night fight in which all semblance of order was lost. Regiment got separated from regiment, troop from troop, and officers from men. There was no guide but the turnpike. Okay, this is the train from Spring Hill to Columbia. You can see Thompson Station there. Ferguson Hall is a celebrated place where Van Dorn got shot in the back of the head. Rippavilla was where Hood had his breakfast conference before the Battle of Nashville. And you can see the Columbia Pike comes down here. Rutherford Creek and Carter's Creek, dozens of places that had to be crossed. And then here's the Duck River, which is a pretty good river right before you get to Columbia. This is just a map of Columbia showing the Duck River there and the fort and the railroad. Okay. At 1 p.m. on December 18th, there was a significant development. Wilson called a temporary halt to the pursuit 7 miles north of Columbia, and he would not resume operations at full measure for several days. Federal cavalry went into camp. The spring finally wound out of its coil. Wilson knew that Hood's men were crossing the Duck River on Ponton bridges, and the federal Ponton Bridge had yet to be delivered, ETA unknown. Wilson's troopers had now been fighting for 3 straight days. They were flat out tired and their horses worn out. Biddle's and Gilbert Johnson's brigades were sent back to Nashville to be replenished, and they never did again enter into the fight. Horses require a lot of feed. Horses are eating machines, according to one expert. Quartermaster regs call for 26 pounds of food per day per horse, or 23 pounds per mule. This consisted of 14 pounds of hay and 12 pounds of grain, usually oats, corn, or barley. Roughly 180 wagons were needed daily to feed Wilson's horses. It's difficult to imagine how Wilson's cavalry and Woods' infantry could be supplied on a daily basis by wagon trains, all using the same main road. As Cheatham's corps prepared to cross the Duck River Ponton Bridge, Forrest and his men arrived with the same intention. Forrest asserted his right to cross first. Cheatham replied, "I think not, sir. You are mistaken. I intend to cross now, and will thank you to move out of the way of my troops." He didn't say that to Forrest. Forrest drew his pistol and rode over to Cheatham and said, "If you are a better man than I am, General Cheatham, your troops can cross ahead of mine." Cheatham reportedly replied, "Shoot! I am not afraid of any man in the Confederacy." General Lee stepped in to mediate and convinced them to apologize. It's not known for certain which group crossed first, but one report asserts that Lee sent Forrest across first and then pacified Cheatham. Okay, by the morning of Tuesday, December the 20th, sleet had turned to snow. as Hood and the main portion of his army left Columbia, having put Forrest in charge of the rear guard, with orders to hold the Duck River line as long as possible. The next destination down the turnpike was the small town of Pulaski, named after the founder of American cavalry, Casimir Pulaski, 28 miles to the south, where the paved turnpike came to an end. South of Columbia, the rolling countryside turned into a much more hilly and barren terrain. Narrow defiles through the hills would restrict movement along the flanks and provide ample opportunities for setting up an ambush. The march of the Army of the Tennessee, miles in length, was resumed on the Pulaski Pike with S.D. Lee's corps in the front, commanded by Stevenson, Cheatham's corps next, and A.P. Stewart's corps bringing up the rear. Walthall was put in charge of the rear guard infantry at Columbia. Forrest now had about 2,000 effective infantry, including 400 men without shoes, and 3,000 cavalry to face a pursuing federal force of more than 10,000 cavalry, armed with repeating rifles and perhaps up to 30,000 infantry. By nightfall on the 20th, Woods' federal infantry rested on the north bank of the Duck River, opposite Columbia, waiting for the Ponton train to arrive. Wilson's cavalry remained in bivouac, waiting for supplies, while Hatch's men stared across the river at Columbia, where Forrest's cavalry and Walthall's infantry lingered. Forrest persuaded Hatch to stop shelling the town. In other news, on December 21st, Sherman's march to the sea ended as his troops entered Savannah, Georgia, on the East Coast. He had led 62,000 troops 285 miles across Georgia and cut a path of destruction more than 50 miles wide. On December 23rd, it took Wilson's cavalry, resupplied and rested, the entire day to cross the Duck River, Woods' 4th Corps having already crossed. Tired of waiting for troopers, Wood began his march south at 2:30 p.m., and 90 minutes later, the infantry confronted Forrest pickets at the Warfield plantation site and drove them further south with a volley of artillery fire. Short time later, Federal infantry came upon Forrest men deployed in the gorge between two high hills 5 miles south of Columbia, which was another delaying action. Now this chart shows Walthall's rear guard infantry. Supposedly this is 30 regiments totaling 1,920 riflemen. You can see how devastated the Confederate units were. And then they took the 8 brigades and consolidated them into 4 brigades under Featherston, Reynolds, Field, and Palmer. This is just a picture of a Confederate cavalryman reenactor, usually riding their own horses, usually supplied and armed with weapons that they captured from the Federals. Their uniforms were anything but uniform. And then here's just a schematic of the rear guard after Columbia. You had Forrest commanding Walthall with Morton as artilleryman. And then basically the cavalry was Chalmers, Rutgers out of the picture, Bell and Buford's 2 brigades, and then Armstrong and Ross. All very capable men. Here's the terrain and the layout south of Columbia. There's Warfield's plantation down the pike. There was a large delaying action at Linville. Buford Station, which ironically is not named after Buford. And then Richland Creek, which runs north and south of Pulaski several times or actually under the turnpike. Pulaski, of course, is known as the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. And this shows the section of the retreat that we're talking about now. By early dawn on Saturday, December the 24th, the last of the Federal Army reached Columbia on the south bank of the Duck River. By 7 a.m., Wilson's cavalrymen began trotting past Woods' infantry on the turnpike. assuming the lead. At noon, at long last, the Federal pursuit began again in earnest. After 5 days of delay, the U.S. Army was in full pursuit again. It would be a day of constant skirmishing, accentuated by periods of heavy fighting. At Richland Creek, Dave Buford was severely wounded and Forrest ordered a retreat. Forrest ordered a retreat when Croxton's and Hammond's brigades flanked Chalmers' line. Forrest continued all the way to Pulaski, and though Wilson pursued, he did not catch up that night. From Richland Creek to Pulaski, the fighting was mostly hand-to-hand. Tyree Bell was put in command, but he didn't know where the Kentucky troops were, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Shacklet of the 8th Kentucky Mounted Infantry. Bell finally did locate them and ordered them across the creek. They were the last to cross before the bridge was demolished, leaving Bell and part of his escort on the north side. An artillery burst knocked Bell from his horse and blinded him in the right eye, permanently as it turned out. Chalmers was also there on the north bank with some of his men. They all fled for their lives, trying to hide amongst the hills. One Federal cavalryman nearly reached Chalmers with his saber before he was shot down. They rode to the top of the hill, turned and volleyed into their pursuers, staggering them. They went down the hill, up another, and did the same thing. They raced across the cornfield to the creek bottom, and for some reason the Federals did not contest their movements. They swam their horses to the south bank of Richland Creek and greeted Forrest and Walthall. After nightfall, Forrest reached Pulaski without further molestation. This is some pictures, a picture of Richland Creek, and then a picture of the terrain, the flatland there. It's hard to see, but it's very soggy and wet. You can see the scrubby nature of the terrain. The ridges in the background are much closer than evident in that picture. Captain Gale of Stewart's Corps recorded the miserable conditions. On we marched, through ice and rain and snow, sleeping on the wet ground at night, many thousands barefooted and actually leaving prints of blood upon the ground. The enemy pressing us in the rear. When we left the pike at Pulaski, we had an awful road, which was strewn with dead horses and mules, broken wagons, and worse than all, broken pontons. How we counted them as we passed them, 1, 2, 3, up to 15. Those were the pontons needed to cross the Tennessee River to safety. There was no turnpike now, only country roads that wound through increasingly hilly terrain, a perfect setting for an ambush. George Estes of the 14th Mississippi was already at the Tennessee River. We could see a rickety pontoon bridge, hastily and insecurely built. It was serpentine in shape, about 12 feet wide and half a mile long, covered from end to end with all kinds of beasts and wagons. There was a Yankee gunboat half a mile or more downriver throwing bombshells, trying to break the bridge, but the shoals prevented it from getting close enough to do any damage. The north end of the bridge had a promiscuous mass of humanity and animals, all trying to get on and over the bridge at the same time. Finally, my time came, and I went forward in great fear that the cable would break and let us all go down into eternity together. But the Lord permitted us to reach the southern shore without loss of one. This is the terrain from Pulaski down to the Tennessee River. And this is the section of the retreat we're talking about now. No more railroad, no more turnpike. This is the terrain that they were facing. This is the main road that goes down here, and you can see how easy an ambush would be. Anthony's Hill is here, which we're going to talk about next. Pulaski is up here, and they're headed down to the Alabama line. Retired General and author John Scales of Modern Times notes that Wilson had 5 strong brigades, 3 independent, and 2 brigades organized into a division under Hatch. During 3 days, when Wilson led the pursuit, he used a different independent brigade as his lead or point element each day, thus rotating the unit exposed to the most danger. He kept Hatch's division back in a column as an integrated unit, so he had a massive force that could maneuver as a whole once the initial contact was made. So Wilson was the overall federal commander. Kuhn and Stewart were in Hatch's command, while Croxton, Harrison, and Hammond operated as 3 individual or independent brigades. This just illustrates the awful conditions on the road. This is from the Grant statue in front of the U.S. Capitol. And this is, again, what I just talked about, how the federal vanguard of the infantry was organized at this time. Anthony's Hill. Christmas Day, Forrest set up an ambush at Anthony's Hill, where the road swerved around the prominence. He used his infantry, cavalry, and artillery forces. Morton's guns, 3 to 6, depending on which report, were positioned on the brow of the hill, where they commanded the line of fire straight up the road. The infantry under Featherston and Palmer flanked guns on the hill, and they were protected by hastily built barricades and supported by dismounted cavalry. Reynolds and Field held back but aligned in reserve. Chalmers, now also commanding Buford's brigade, was on the side road guarding the right flank. Armstrong was at the front, protecting the left flank of the main road, with Ross protecting the right flank. So broken is the ground at this point, said Walthall, and so densely wooded that there was no difficulty in effectively concealing the troops. Harrison's troopers arrived about 1 p.m. to find several of Ross's men fleeing in mock fright, trying to draw the Federals into the trap. Harrison was hesitant, but approached nonetheless because he thought the number of the enemy was small. He ordered his men to dismount and form into line. As they reached the critical point, Morton's so-called bold pups opened with double canister, and infantry charged down the slopes from both directions. The ambush worked perfectly. Harrison's troopers broke and ran, losing about 150 men killed or wounded, according to Forrest's after-action report. Approximately 40 Confederates were killed or wounded. This is just a picture of Confederate cavalry charging into the Federals. Battle at Sugar Creek. Daylight on Monday, December 26th, witnessed 2 significant events: the completion of the bridge of 80 mountain boats across the Tennessee River and the ambush of Wilson's cavalry by Forrest at Sugar Creek, about 30 miles back. This was in the morning. There was dense fog. The Confederates were well hidden. Forrest men killed or wounded 150 Federal troopers and captured a dozen. Reportedly, 400 Federal horses were killed and 350 others captured. Hammond said, the Federal said, it was a spirited action followed, in which the 2nd Tennessee, U.S. Tennessee, supported by the 4th, drove the enemy into his works. A Confederate charge was made in turn by 2 columns of infantry, with cavalry in the center, driving us back about 300 yards across the creek, where we rallied and drove them back to their works, holding the position until the afternoon, when the 14th Ohio Battery shelled their rear guard out of their works, commanding the road. This is Forrest's version. On the morning of the 26th, the enemy commenced advancing, driving back General Ross's pickets. Owing to the dense fog, he could not see the temporary fortifications which infantry had thrown up and behind which they secreted. The enemy therefore advanced to within 50 paces of these works when a volley was opened upon him, causing the wildest confusion. 2 mounted regiments of Ross's brigade and Ecker's and Granbury's brigades of infantry were ordered to charge upon the discomfited foe, which was done, producing a complete rout. The enemy was pursued for 2 miles. It's a little bit more than 300 yards. but the enemy showing no disposition to give battle, my troops were ordered back. Okay. And there's the bridge. After covering the crossing of Cheatham's and Stevenson's Corps, Stewart's Corps crossed the river on the precarious Taunton Bridge all day on Tuesday the 27th. The bridge bulged downstream in the swift current of the wide river, and infantry had to cross single file 3 paces apart. After dark, Forrest and his cavalry crossed, leaving only Walthall's rear guard on the north side of the river. On December 28th at 3 a.m., Walthall set into motion so as to reach the bridge at daylight. One brigade would depart at a time, first Featherston, then Field and Palmer. Reynolds withdrew his command from Shoal Creek in time to reach the main line by daybreak, leaving a skirmish line behind for half an hour. Ector's brigade would be the last to cross, and Coleman's 39th North Carolina the last regiment, before engineers began dismantling the bridge. Walthall directed that 200 of his men assist the engineers. By the late morning of December 28th, the Army of Tennessee had crossed and the Taunton Bridge was taken up. Private Stevenson said, the passage of the river being effected, we at last breathed free. Our long, very shameful flight was done. The control of the Army appeared to be in the hands of Lieutenant General A.P. Stewart. He seemed to be the real leader throughout the retreat and directed passage over the river. On December 29th, Thomas officially called an end to the pursuit. Now, Hood's army was not destroyed, but just like Hood himself, his army had been severely disabled. Forrest was so appalled at the condition of the army, he wrote, the Army of Tennessee was badly defeated and is greatly demoralized, and to save it during the retreat from Nashville, I was compelled almost to sacrifice my command. On January 23, 1865, the Army of Tennessee, numbering 18,742 men, or 14,500 according to the Federal, reached Tupelo, Mississippi. That same day, General Richard Taylor arrived to assume command, General Hood having submitted his letter of resignation to President Jefferson Davis 10 days earlier. In March of 1865, Harry Wilson took 13,500 well-armed troopers on a 525-mile raid through Alabama and Georgia, defeating Forrest at Selma and recapturing the 12-pounder Napoleon lost at Anthony's Hill, capturing Montgomery, burning Columbus, Georgia to the ground, and assisting in the capture of Jefferson Davis. He inflicted 8,000 casualties while sustaining 725. On March 30th, Wilson ordered McCook to direct Croxton to torch the Alabama University at Tuscaloosa in retribution for the school's cadets who fought at the Battle of the Barricade back on December 16th. Wilson, the boy general, died in 1925 in Wilmington, North Carolina, having outlived all but 3 other Civil War generals. And I don't know who those were. It's ironic that George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and the sledgehammer of Nashville could make the single most critical mistake of the pursuit. Thomas never forgave himself for not having a mobile force ready to cut off Hood after the Battle of Nashville. His failure was a grave error of judgment, he later told friends, adding that Hood's army ought to have been captured. However, Thomas never quite took personal responsibility for sending the Federal Taunton train down the wrong road. In conclusion, given their overwhelming numbers and firepower and the beaten-down condition of Hood's army, the Federals under Thomas and Wilson should have rather easily have bagged the entire rebel army and either annihilated them or shipped them off to northern prisoner of war camps. The fact that neither one of these possibilities occurred is testament to Yankee overconfidence and floundering, the appalling winter weather, the rugged terrain, and last but not least, the tactics of the Confederate rear guard. That is my formal presentation. I wanted to show you a couple more things here. This is the Franklin Turnpike today. Franklin is a very affluent town. I wanted to show you Spring Hill. This is the village of Spring Hill here. From 2010 to 2020, it grew by 96%. This is the Saturn plant. It's now a GMC plant. here's the interstate here. All this is growth. This is what's happening in Middle Tennessee now. And there's a $2.3 billion battery plant for that area. So if you want to go and see that, you better go soon. This is some further suggested reading, Dennis Belcher and John Scales. Only 13% of 8th grade students show proficiency in learning history, according to a recent survey, the lowest level ever recorded. The next worst proficiency category was civics. Not sure our republic can survive as citizens who are unconscious or uncaring about their own history. Come down and visit us in Nashville. We finally got rid of this abomination, the statue of Forrest. It looks like he was having some problems there or something, but finally got rid of him. So y'all come down and see us. This is my information, and I'll try and answer any questions that you might have.
We have questions?
Yes, sir.
Can you give us more information from the Confederate side? Where did the forage for the animals come from? Where did their ammunition come from?
Thanks, Brown. That's all I can tell you. Now, Hood knew what was happening at Nashville, and he had Chalmers send all of his supply wagons down to Brentwood. That was before the rout. And so he had, sufficient supply to survive, I guess. But you're right. I mean, how do you forage in the middle of winter in barren territory? It's my contention that, Wilson's horses were not up to speed since, you had to go everywhere to find them. Plus the fact that not all of his troopers had repeating rifles, as is the common knowledge.
Any information about the desertion rate of the Confederates on the retreat?
Well, there was desertions for sure. A lot of the men were from Tennessee, Army of the Tennessee. A lot of them didn't have anything to go back to, but I have no figures on that. I don't think there are any figures on that. At this point, the Confederates could either fight to the death, they could give up and surrender, they could be captured, or they could run. And that's basically what it amounted to. I was talking to John about the fact, why did these Confederates fight like this for so long under such terrible conditions when they knew they were going to lose? I think one of the aspects was that they were terrified of being taken prisoner and shipped off to Camp Douglas and died during the winter of disease and so forth. That's what they had heard, whether it be true or not, but that was their fear, I believe. And esprit de corps didn't want to abandon their own men. Yes, sir.
Wasn't one of Thomas's biggest problems Grant? While he was trying to get a pursuit force with horses, Grant was on the train within a day or two of coming out to relieve him for not moving faster.
Yeah, he'd sent Logan already on the train. He was about to get on one when he heard that Thomas had moved. Now, the week before the battle was severe cold, ice, snow. Horses could not move in ice. So he had to wait till the ground thawed out. There was still some snow on the ground when he attacked on the 15th. But you're right, yeah, Grant didn't put up with Thomas's delaying, no matter what the cause. And Thomas said, hell, he doesn't know what's going on here. He's in Washington. I think Thomas is kind of an underrated general. Oh, yes, sir.
What was the strategic importance of Nashville if both sides were conflicting over it?
Well, for one thing, buy my latest book. For another, Nashville pretty much served as the staging area for all other campaigns. Atlanta, Chattanooga, Murfreesboro never would have happened if they hadn't captured Nashville. And Nashville is a big munitions manufacturer, gunpowder plants, and basically what happened was, for all practical effects, Nashville was taken when Fort Henry was taken on the Tennessee River, and the federal gunboats could go all the way down to this area where I was talking about, where they crossed the Tennessee River down in Florence. They could go down there with impunity. Fort Donaldson was the icing on the cake, I guess. But no, Nashville was vitally important.
You mentioned Douglas artillery a couple, you mentioned Douglas artillery a couple times. Was that the Texas unit?
Yes.
Texas? And did they fight the whole, I noticed you kept talking about different places where they were engaged. Did they go all the way from Nashville, all the way to the end?
I'm not sure about that, but the Confederates, unfortunately, they kept losing their guns, either being captured or having to abandon them in the mud.
And the Douglas artillery lost their guns too?
I'm sorry?
The Douglas artillery also lost some of their guns?
Yes, they lost some of their guns, I know. I don't know whether it was all of them or not.
Okay, thank you.
To be honest with you. I know this is Wisconsin, but there's a new book that's come out on the Chicago Board of Trade Battery. It's a regimental history, and those guys were everywhere. And they did yeoman service. They were at Stones River. I think they were at Shiloh. Anyway, it's a good book you might want to look into.
Well, Mark, thank you. Have here the certificate of honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Mark Zimmerman for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Sorry, you're not done. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the veterans of the Iron Brigade formed an association. In the 1880s, they admitted their children and grandchildren to the organization, and in 1990, 2 sons of veterans of the Iron Brigade gave custodianship of the association to the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. With that, it is my pleasure to present a lapel pin signifying membership in the association to Mark Zimmerman.
Wow. And thank you all again. You've been a very attentive audience.